Good afternoon, everyone. I am here to present a presentation that's near and dear to my heart about addressing stress and adversity in the workplace with stress first aid. Interestingly, the inception of the stress first aid model occurred at an ISTSS conference many years ago. We had a group of around 50 experts from around the world come together at the request of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Association to answer the key question of how can you advise people who are in the middle of ongoing stress and adversity? What would you recommend for a group like that? And we had been involved with SAMHSA providing post-disaster interventions, but they realized they needed some guidance about people who were in the middle of ongoing threat, ongoing adversity. So this group of people came together from all around the world. Some were researchers, some were people from on the ground who had lessons learned from different types of events. And we presented the research to them that we had gathered. We talked for the day about what would we recommend. And we came up with, at the brilliance of Stephen Hopball, kind of summarizing all that we had talked about. He said it seems like there are 5 universal elements, and those universal elements are creating a sense of safety. It doesn't have to be absolute safety, but it's moving people in the direction of a greater sense of safety, helping to calm people down, helping to get them connected with social support, helping them have a greater sense of self-efficacy, which is this feeling that they have the skills and the resources that they need to get through different types of adversity, and creating a sense of hope in people. And hope is a broad and kind of messy term. It maps onto optimism. It maps onto having enough resources. It maps onto religious faith and philosophical beliefs. We know that when people are faced with adversity and they have at least one of these elements, they don't have to have all 5, they tend to do better than people that don't have them. So oftentimes when I give a training, I'll say, I know you won't remember everything that I say, but if you remember this slide and you work towards helping people have a greater sense of safety, calming them down, getting them connected with social support, increasing their sense of skills and resources to feel like they can get through this, and giving them a greater sense of hope, then you're doing a really good piece of work with them. So this expert panel resulted in us writing this kind of seminal paper about the 5 essential elements to bring into immediate and midterm mass trauma intervention. And years later, I was asked by, well, not years, it was about a year later, I was asked by some colleagues to present materials for Navy and Marine Corps. And that ended up morphing into a request to create a model that could help them deal with ongoing situations of adversity. And they liked this 5 essential elements paper. So we created this model, Stress First Aid, for them. Since then, word has gotten out, and we've created different versions for other occupations that are typically faced with high stress, including fire and EMS professionals, rail workers, wildland firefighters, law enforcement professionals, pretrial and probation officers, healthcare workers, and harm reduction workers. So the model is kind of expanded out into many different cultures, that I would call them. And each time we created a new version of this model, we had interviews or focus groups where we would present the framework, the general framework, to people and ask them, what would this look like in your particular setting? So we got a lot of quotes. We summarized them in key actions for people, because we were trying to make it very practical and usable material for people, and that it would map onto the settings that they were in. How did this end up being described? The way we would describe stress first aid is that we wanted to create a very flexible framework that validates what people are already doing, right? Many high stress jobs have programs in place and people doing things that they know are helpful, that are based on these kind of protective elements that we know are kind of universal. So the framework is an ability to organize what they're already doing, to validate what they're already doing, and to validate it by saying, we know it's evidence informed. I wouldn't say it's evidence based, but we know there's a literature base for each one of those key elements. And you could now say, look, what you're doing is recommended because we know it's protective. And so keep doing it. Don't let it fall aside. Bring it forward, especially in times of high stress. We hope, again, as I said, it validates what's already being done. And we know that we worked really hard to try to make it really practical and that it makes sense for people on the ground. We weren't trying to make it into a mental health model. We were trying to make it into a support model. So what we found is that the key characteristics of this model are that it's very flexible. It should never look the same each and every time you use it, that the timing and the context are important, that depends upon what's happening at that moment. You bring forward different types of elements. We really highlight mentoring and problem solving in workplaces. It's a first aid model, so it's not meant to address all ranges of issues. It's hopefully what we would call an indicated preventive model. So you use it when it's indicated. We know that indicated prevention seems to be more helpful than kind of universal prevention models. And our goal also is to create what we would call a dignified path towards higher care if a person needs it. So we want to bring people into treatment if they need it. And so the model hopefully will also bridge people into treatment if it's needed in a more expeditious way, in a quicker way than they might have gotten there without this model. And one of the key principles of stress first aid is that we are trying to create just small toeholds in a person's day or in a group's day where what we would say it's a relatively insignificant position from which further progress can be made. We know from looking at a lot of the literature on habit formation, for instance, that you have to take tiny moments, little small moments where people can make progress. If you try to say to people, you have to do a half an hour worth of this or an hour worth of that, it's probably going to fall aside when workplaces get stressful. So we're trying to bring forward moments of self-care, moments of coworker support that can have a cumulative effect over time. So we think that the model is a little bit different from other resilience building models in the sense that rather than telling people how they should take care of themselves or how they should support each other, it just highlights the importance of these five elements that I mentioned. We know that they're protective. We know that they're important. And so what we're saying is that when you get highly stressed, those are the things that sometimes fall aside, right? They fall away and you're focused on what needs to be done. But we want people to try to bring them forward as much as they can in these small ways, because we know that oftentimes helpful support can often only arise with people being a little bit more self-reflective or when they've got these sort of unspoken understandings between them and the people that they work with. That sometimes is the best kind of support. So frequently, it's only in those moment-to-moment behaviors or encounters that the right support can happen because you know that that person understands you, or you know that you're going to be disciplined enough to take a moment to quiet yourself and give yourself a break, right? And so we hope that if people are aware of the importance of these protective factors and open to being creative, so that they don't have to do it the same way every time, or they can try to find ways to do it where it makes sense, that it's going to increase their ability to have self-care and support their colleagues. So I want to just take a moment to say that during COVID in particular, I was looking into different sort of frameworks or models that could particularly give some guidance around uncertainty. And right now, a lot of my colleagues and a lot of people I work with feel like the world is kind of an uncertain place, right? And very similar to COVID. And this model called the Cynefin model really appealed to me. It was written in part by a number of people, but Dave Snowden seems to be the main author of the model. And in this model, it highlights that there are different types of situations that can create both chaos and complexity, and that in those moments where there's a lot of complexity and a lot of change, the idea of having well-being really requires a certain, I guess, toolkit of abilities. And the first one, first and foremost, is the ability to respond to ever-changing context. And one of the ways they recommend doing that is to take a lessons learning approach. Rather than lessons learned, you're learning in the moment. It really requires a lot of like flexibility and also enhanced communication between people who are working in an agency or on a team. So bring communication forward, check in with each other regularly, modify your expectations so that you're not expecting so much from yourself or your team. You realize none of us are at our best. We're all doing the best we can in the context of this kind of chaotic, complex situation, and do your best to stay present and centered and grounded in the context of these very fluid conditions. The hope is that you'll also continually reassess, try different things out. If they don't work, tolerate that and remain creative. Keep trying new things. So I really like the way that it's explained in this model, and it really fits with our model in stress first aid because we're really trying to highlight that things are going to change and you try these little toeholds, you try different things as you go along. It should never look the same from moment to moment. It also kind of fits with some research that was done around management research, and they brought it forward during COVID, saying maybe these lessons from management research can help us because we know that in trying times, the key things that are helpful, especially when there's a lot of uncertainty, are for leaders to put people first, put their team first, try to be very creative in the way you manage things, including like, you know, doing things on the fly, attending more to teamwork and communication, maybe creating outside partnerships with other agencies to ask to get, problem solving, like what are you doing? What's working for you? Be very clear and humble in your leadership so you're authentic as a leader and you are clear that you're sensitive to the welfare of your workers and their experience, and that you're doing your best to create an effective response to what's happening around you. I'm seeing this a lot with our leadership at the National Center for PTSD. They're doing such a great job of having really clear, open communication and conveying how much they care about us as a team. So I'm seeing it in action. It's wonderful. We think that people in high stress jobs are really an important population because in the cultures that I've worked in, these are people that have a service orientation, right? They want to help others. And we talk about this in our model that usually people who are in service oriented occupations have guiding ideals that make them want to be in occupations like this. And those can create a lot of strength in the person. So typically, what we're seeing in all the organizations we work in, that people have a certain type of selflessness. They put the welfare of others above their own. They're very loyal. They're very stoic. They maintain a kind of ability to endure because their job has meaning for them. They have a strong moral code about what's right and wrong, and they want to become better at what they're doing on a, keep improving. And so, what we highlight in our model is that those are all strengths. And it's great because when you have those ideals and you get into jobs like this, it actually makes you stronger, right? You have plenty of opportunities to embrace and sort of operationalize those ideals in service-oriented jobs. However, they can also create vulnerabilities. So, whenever I'm giving trainings, I often will ask people, um, how many of you have put off making a medical appointment that you probably need because you're so busy or you're focused on others? And we usually get, a third to a half of the room raising their hands. So what we're trying to do with this model is also say, be aware that you have a lot of strength, but also be aware that you could potentially have some vulnerabilities because of these ideals of yours. Maybe you're putting care for yourself off. Maybe you feel more guilt if things don't go the way you wish they would have. Maybe your stoicism actually decreases your ability to even tune in and know what you need. And maybe your moral code makes you more likely to be frustrated with people if they also don't have that moral code. And then lastly, maybe you're more prone to being hard on yourself or feeling ashamed if you're not living up to your ideals. So Mark Manson has written a number of books, and I really like some of the things he says about Stoicism in particular. So he has a few quotes that I think fit on both sides of this, what we call double-edged sword of values and ideals. On the positive side, he would say, finding something important and meaningful in your life will help you sustain the effort needed to overcome the particular problems you face. I see this all the time with first responders, with military people. When you anyone even potentially suggests, well, maybe you need to change jobs because this is too stressful, they'll say, no, I don't want a job that's not stressful because this one has meaning for me. I want to be of service. I want to do what I'm doing. And that helps them overcome a lot of the stress that they experience. On the flip side, though, Mark Manson also says stress reactions are simply biological signals designed to nudge you in the direction of beneficial change. They're a sign that something is going unaddressed, a call to action. So, what we're trying to do with this model is increase people's awareness that yes, your job is meaningful. Yes, it's important. It doesn't mean you have to quit when you're stressed. However, we also want you to pay attention to the other side and these little biological nudges to take better care of yourself, right? So, my experience has been that it's hard to implement solutions in high stress jobs like this because what you see is that time and resources tend to map with self-care and coworker support, and they also map onto stress and burnout. So when you have more time and resources, you have better self-care and support and less stress and burnout. But when you have less time and resources, self-care goes down, coworker support goes down, and stress and burnout go up. So that to me is why it's important to have a very flexible model, because what the last thing we would want to do is teach people how to be resilient and then have them blame themselves if they can't implement the things that we say are so good, right? So we're trying to tell them to fit it in how they can, depending upon circumstances. I also see in many of the models that I've looked at is that if you give people particular things, you have to do this in order to feel better, you will have a certain percentage of people in your group that say, that's not going to work for me, right? So, for instance, like mindfulness practices, we know have a lot of research evidence, but there will always be somebody in the group that says, I don't want to do mindfulness. I want to make lists and check them off. That's what makes me feel better. So, the model also has to be flexible in saying, look, you need to find what works best for you. The other thing that I noticed during COVID is I went out and started looking at like what are other people recommending in times of uncertainty like this. And what I was seeing is that a lot of the uh, articles I was reading were aimed at a certain level of stress, right? It was like maybe a mild to moderate level of stress. And here's what you can do to feel better, right? So one in particular, you press on your forehead, you feel better. But what I was seeing in people is that they're saying, that's not going to work for me. That's too intense. My stress levels are so intense. This is what my forehead is going to look like if I press on it. So another part of our model that I like a lot was developed before I even came in with the five essential elements. It was already developed by two of the co-authors of Stress First Aid who said, look, we need to normalize stress. So, particularly in a military environment, what was happening was that people felt like if they weren't in this green or ready zone, that meant that something was wrong with them, right? So the co-authors of Stress First Aid said, look, we need to just tell them, no, it's not about always being in the green zone. We all cycle in and out of different zones of stress all the time. So to make it simple, they color coded it and said, look, a lot of us are in the yellow zone. We're in there regularly. This is about the normal multiple stressors that you experience at work and home. It creates a kind of mild transient distress. And actually, some people function better in the yellow zone even than the green zone because it motivates them, right? When you have adrenaline, when you have deadlines, it can increase your energy and can make you feel better. However, um, what happens is a kind of a curvilinear model here where if it's too much, then you start to see changes in mood, more anxiety, more irritability, sadness, maybe even physical changes or social changes. And so I've given trainings where people have raised their hands and said, look, can we just acknowledge that yellow is the new green? None of us are in the green zone anymore. But our goal is to try to move people back towards the green as much as we can. However, acknowledging that it's very common for people to be in other zones of stress. The orange zone is where we originally targeted the stress first aid model. And in this zone, what we were trying to convey is that you see people going into more of an orange zone of stress when they're responding to either this buildup of yellow zone stress that's gone on for too long, and we call that a fatigue injury or a wear and tear injury, or they're faced with yellow zone stress layered with inner conflict. We see that with moral injury, where people are saying, I wish I had done things differently, or I wish my agency was doing things differently. Or they're faced with life threat or trauma, or they're faced with loss. So when you start to see more significant stressors or a buildup of yellow zone stress, you start to see people more likely to move into a higher stress zone. And you see then that they have more severe or persistent distress or loss of functioning, right? Oftentimes people would say, I don't feel like myself anymore, or my family is saying I'm no longer like my typical self. What we're trying to do with stress first aid is to try to catch people in this zone in particular and move them back towards yellow and green. I want to just highlight, though, what often happens is people look at this kind of model and they think, well, red has got to be the worst. Yes, it's worse in the sense that we identify that when people get into the red zone, this is usually, a result of like either prolonged stress or risk factors, and they start to be qualifying for clinical mental disorders. Most typical ones are depression, anxiety, substance use disorders, or PTSD, right? So it looks like it's the worst zone, right? But what I have seen oftentimes is that I've known people in high stress jobs that have probably qualify for one or more clinical diagnoses, and they're doing great on the job. They're just suffering in silence. They're functioning okay on the job, but they're having something that qualifies them for a disorder, but it's not necessarily showing up at work, right? And so a person can be in the orange zone and be faced with a strong stressor in that moment and look worse than they would in the red zone, right? So our goal with this stress continuum was to have people normalize stress zones. Again, these are kind of artificially created, but to normalize that you can go in and out of different zones, to also have an ability to have a shorthand way to talk about stress, right? Like you don't have to explain to people that you just yelled at your family or that you're having trouble sleeping. You can just say, I'm kind of in the orange zone. It can also normalize like overall work stress and say, where people can say, we are all in the orange zone. We need to do something different. Okay. Because we've been parked here for months. So the goal is to have an ability to have conversations about stress reactions and then to do something about it. So an example that we gathered, an employee appeared overwhelmed and self-reported, look, I'm in the orange. So we determined what tasks others could assist with to alleviate some of the stress. The employee was satisfied with the teamwork. Again, our goal is to create really simple little things that can be done, raise awareness. Okay, we're in a higher zone of stress. Let's do something about it, right? And it maps onto some of the research we've looked at. There's a really nice study by Levi Giggy in 2016 that looked at first responders. And George Bonanno and his shop have really looked at flexible coping strategies as well, and a flexible mindset. What this study suggested is that first responders in high emotionally intense contexts have different coping strategies than when they're in low emotionally intense contexts. They prefer distraction in high emotionally intense contexts, including mainly their definition is just disengaging their attention away from what's going on inside them and directing it towards what's happening in front of them, what needs to be done in that moment. And in the long term, when they're in a less emotionally intense context, they build in a whole array of coping strategies that the researchers called reappraisal. And those can include things like they're going to let themselves experience what happened. Oh yeah, that was really intense. They're going to make meaning out of it. They're going to integrate it into the overall framework of their life. They're going to confirm or reconfirm their values and say, I'm going to still keep doing what I'm doing. I am safe now. I'm going to keep my plans and goals. I'm going to continue to care for others. And I'm also going to find ways to reduce any painful emotions that I'm now allowing myself to experience. And I'm going to build in the buffer of having different types of distraction and amusement or meaningful activities that can buffer me for things that are happening. What they found is that typically when people allow themselves to stay focused in that emotionally intense context, they have less distress. And in the long run, if they build in these other coping strategies, less PTSD. And so we've seen it go wrong in a few different ways in the settings we've worked in. The first one is, and many of you may have seen this, when you try to engage people in reappraisal strategies too soon, they're going to resist you sometimes and say, I don't want to talk about it. they don't want their distress level to go up, or they're too focused on things that need to get done in that moment. So if you try to get them in a group to talk about what happened and how they felt about it, might not be the best strategy in terms of the timing, right? So timing is important here. The other thing that we see a lot of times is that people just kind of park themselves in distraction. They remain kind of workaholics, or I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to focus on how I feel. And then you might tend to see an increase in PTSD. So again, this maps onto the idea that you have to be flexible depending on context. And it also fits with some of what George Bonanno has said in his work with flexible mindset, where he recommends, especially when people are in the middle of something really intense, that they should ask themselves key questions, raise their self-awareness. What's happening right now? What do I need to do right now? But what am I able to do? Might be a different answer to that question. And is it working? Very important question. If people are able to ask questions like this and a series of questions over and over again. Okay, is it working? No. Okay, now what's happening? What do I need to do? What am I able to do? They're much more likely to start to build a repertoire of different types of strategies that might be helpful for them, other than staying parked or stuck in one strategy that sometimes works, but over time, if they keep just doing that one thing, it actually can create unintended problems, right? So what we've seen with the stress continuum is that people have been able to be really flexible depending upon which zone they're in. This is one of my favorite examples. The wildland firefighters I've worked with, one of them created this little worksheet that they can use before they get deployed to fight fires, where they say, all right, let's think this through. Like, what does it look like when I'm in the green zone? How do I feel? What do I notice physically? What behaviors do I engage in when I'm in the green zone? And what are some of the tools that I use to maintain my strength? How about when I'm in the yellow zone? What does that feel and look like? What are some tools I can use to maybe reset back toward the green? Same thing with orange and red. Like, how is it different? And this helps them to be more self-aware and create different strategies, right? It may be that when you're in the red zone, your friend group is very different than it is in the green or yellow. Maybe you're going to go to people that can have more conversations about your feelings, or maybe help you get, into treatment. Have compassion for how you're struggling, versus friends in the yellow and green that are like, let's just go have some beer, right? So thinking it through, what do I need in different zones? What does support look like for me in different zones? Can I even create a contact list of who I might talk with when I'm in different zones, including professional resources? And so this sets them up to have a little bit more of an ability to be thoughtful about what's helpful for them. And so moving from this idea of self-awareness and the stress zones, we then brought in this 5 essential element model to create the core actions of stress first aid, right? So we started with those 5 elements that I mentioned. Because it's a model that is a long-term kind of culture changing model, we want people to use this from the first day they start a high stress job to the day they end that job. And we wanted it to be very holistic, including not just work stress, but whatever stress is in their life, including what's happening at home, right? So we wanted to make sure that we added the 2 components of checking in regularly, self-check, and also checking in with your colleagues or coworkers. And then also knowing what resources are available, always being aware of what other resources need to be brought in. So that's coordinate. Because it was a model that we were going to be training people in, we thought, okay, let's make all the letters of the core actions start with the same letter. It'll be easier to remember. It was the Navy. We were like, oh, the 7 C's, that's kind of cute. They'll remember that. So we changed safety to cover, calming and connectedness stayed the same. Self-efficacy became competence, and hope became confidence. So that's how the stress first aid model kind of became born into this, originally into the military culture, and then broadening out into the other cultures. And if you want to boil it down to the essential skills, what we're trying to do with especially the stress continuum, is to help people recognize, and then to act, and then to know what they need to do. So recognize when you yourself or a peer has a stress injury, or they're in higher zones of stress, and then to do something. So if you see something, say something, either to that person or to somebody that might be a better support for them. Talk to your friends for yourself. Like, look, here are some of my red zone kind of, or orange or red zone red flags. When I start to act like this, I want you to call me on it, right? So you can do it for others or for yourself. And then know at least a couple of other resources that you might offer to somebody else in distress, or that you might say to yourself, you know what, when I get to this level, I need to go do X, Y, or Z. I need to talk to my therapist. I need to go get a massage. I need to, whatever it is, know what the resources are that would be the most helpful. And so I want to quickly go through the core actions. I will not be able to do them justice in the amount of time we have, but the check actions, we tried to, as a group of co-authors of this model, operationalize each action a little bit better. So we wanted to include a few categories for each action. So with check, we thought it was really important to observe. First, keep an eye on people. Look, pay attention. All of us have had the experience that you ask a coworker, how you doing? And they'll say, I'm fine. If you have observed first and said, you know what, I know you say you're fine, but I've noticed you've been a little bit withdrawn, or you haven't laughed as much, or you're not having lunch with us, or you seem to be a little more irritable, then you've got a little bit more clout to have a conversation with them. And especially if you're keeping track, not only of things you're noticing about them, but maybe you're keeping track of things they've told you, like I'm going through a divorce, or my child is sick, or I'm taking care of older uh, generations and they're not doing well. So if you're keeping track of their stressors, or what it looks like for them to be distressed, or, not function as well, then it's easier to have a conversation about it. Also, you want to keep track of, well, last week I had coffee with them and we had a conversation, but I'm noticing they're still not doing well. Or I noticed that what they really like is when somebody can take something off their plate. Pay attention to those kinds of things. And then it may be that you're not close enough to them to be the person that they trust, or that is able to, know what's going on with them. So you want to also take into account their interactions with others and get collateral information so that you can best figure out what is needed. And then decide, are they a danger to themselves or others? Are they making mistakes? Or are they, maybe it looks like they're stressed, but I think they're still in the yellow zone, so maybe they don't need any support yet, or maybe they're in the red zone and they might need something more than just what I can offer to them. And we're also, we try to operationalize what a stress indicator could look like. So we've included things that we've gathered over the years from the people that we've worked with. These are some of the most common stress indicators that we've gathered across different cultures. Most people have said, look, when I'm really, really tired all the time and it's just bone fatigue, that is an indicator to me that I'm probably moving into the higher zones. Maybe I'm having trouble sleeping, I'm having trouble focusing, my feelings get more intense, or on the flip side, I'm just kind of numb. Maybe I'm getting more isolated, or there are things I'm doing that are uncharacteristic, that aren't really supporting my well-being or others, making more mistakes. Compulsive behavior is a really common one, and that's just not with substances. It's also with buying, online shopping, maybe binge watching too much, and you're forgetting about your other things that need to get done. Anything that feels, eating compulsively, that type of thing. Feeling like you can't really enjoy what's going on around you, or feeling really avoidant. Those are really common ones. Those are just a short menu, though. Everyone's going to have their own array of things that should help them understand what zone of stress they're in. And so we include, when we first created this model, it was purely a coworker support, peer support model. When we moved to other cultures, especially first responder cultures, we were asked to include self-care. We wanted it to be focused on coworker support originally because we really wanted to highlight how important social support is. And that's where, even if people had been trained in being resilient, really they need each other at that moment, and they need to mitigate the stress as colleagues in that moment. But when we moved to different cultures, they were like, we also need some information about self-care. We don't really have those training programs in how to be resilient, or sometimes our coworkers are our greatest stress. So please, teach us things we can do for ourselves as well. So we include self care actions for check. The biggest one that I've seen across every culture I've worked in, healthcare, first responder, is this idea of giving yourself permission to take care of yourself. A lot of us know what we need to do to take care of ourselves, but we don't give ourselves permission. And so making a conscious effort to say, you know what, I have to put these things in place, and being aware of what it is in you that is probably something that should require your attention and paying attention to those things sooner rather than later. Some examples that we've gathered. I like this one a lot because this was, especially for leaders, I have a lot of concern about leaders in high stress work jobs. And one of the things we've heard frequently is a lot of times leaders don't want to ask how people are doing because they feel like then they have to do something about it. And they don't feel like they always know what they can do. Sometimes they feel constrained by the agency they're in. So they start to avoid even asking people. What this wise leader said is, look, it's okay to ask about what people's needs are and what their challenges are, but also ask them what's working so it doesn't devolve into just complaints. And also let them know, may not be able to fix everything, but together as a team, we can try to creatively problem solve to mitigate or at least buffer the challenges that we're faced with, right? And doesn't You don't have to be responsible for making it all better, but you can work together to try to figure out things that can maybe alleviate some of the stress. So moving from check to coordinate, coordinate, as I mentioned, is about making sure that you have resources available. So I'm just going to quickly say it's about collaborating, informing whoever might need to know if you're concerned about someone, and then finding resources. Okay. And we feel like what works best is trying to find out what resources are available. It could be clinicians, mentors, peers, coaches, chaplains, hotlines. Find out what they are, and put them in a place where it's easy for people to access them. Also consider mentoring and problem solving as a potential coordinate action, like where do we need to go next? And try to find the most acceptable ways to refer people to whatever support they might need. With cover, remember, is moving people towards safety. And this can include in the moment types of things by just standing by and helping the person feel safe because you're there to protect or, assist them. It could also be that you're making others safe, especially if you're worried about a person not making the right decisions or not being focused. And it could also be this long-term kind of sense of encouraging that this is a safe work environment by being caring, trying to reduce chaos or danger, and being there to listen and communicate. Two-way communication is crucial. One example that we gathered, I like to give a briefing before we might be potentially in unsafe situations. This is something we could encounter. This is what we're going to do if these things happen. Let's problem solve ahead of this situation. Another team that I really liked on what they found, especially in healthcare settings, is that people don't want to burden each other, right? So I'm not going to talk to my coworkers because I know we're all going through the same thing and I don't want to burden them with my stress. So this team came up with the idea that they'd have a whiteboard in their lounge and they would write their name on the stress continuum if they were in the green/yellow, to give permission to people to say, look, it's okay to lean on me today. I'm doing okay. If you can talk to me if you're having a hard day and it's not going to be a burden for me. And they also gave themselves permission to take their name off if during the day they moved out of that zone into a higher stress zone. So I thought that was very creative. In terms of self-care, again, what we found for people that aren't feeling safe is that, again, give yourself permission. Boundaries is really important. Find strategies for setting good boundaries. If you have people in your life that help you feel more safe, please call on them if you're going through a difficult time. Don't worry that you're going to burden them. Just reach out. And some people have said they distract themselves by focusing on what they can accomplish or focusing on something that they can control, like their own breathing, and realizing also that no one's perfect and everyone's going to have strengths and vulnerabilities. So being a little bit gentler on themselves. Partly because what we've heard a lot is that people have said, look, I'm my own worst enemy. I probably feel the least safe inside my own head. So teaching people to be a little more gentle and kind to themselves is also another cover self-care action. Calm, I think most anyone who's a part of ISTSS knows that there are multiple calm things that you can do to calm yourself down, quieting yourself, composing by drawing your attention or the attention of somebody you're worried about outwards, distracting, trying to refocus, recuperating, giving yourself sleep or a timeout. And then obviously in people in professions that are drawn to ISTSS, we know that listening empathically and talking with people in a kind, caring way can reduce their emotional intensity. It's obvious to those of us in this field. So anytime that you can do that in a way, there's lots of different ways to calm people. One example I really like is they decided that if something was really going wrong, if it was a high stress day, they gave themselves permission to say, okay, orange huddle. That means everyone take a breath. We're coming together. It's not about blaming this on, something or shaming people. It means there's an issue. Let's talk about it. Okay. Something's happening and it's tense. It's a shorthand way of like, let's take a moment. All right. What do we need to do? Let's problem solve, right? This might be the shift from hell, but we're going to make it through together as a team, right? And self-care, again, I don't need to belabor this slide because those of you who are in this field know there's lots of different strategies for calming yourself. I will say that if you're dealing with uncertainty and long-term kinds of adversity, the idea of focusing is really important, focusing on whatever helps you to focus on the present moment. There's a whole psychological and philosophical literature on this that goes back centuries, right? Focus. Always being realistic, like focusing on maybe or it might, or sometimes not getting into this black and white thinking. Plan for stress reactions, plan for what might happen ahead. Have acceptance. Focus on what you're grateful for rather than worst case scenarios. Focus on changing your thoughts or beliefs that don't serve you in that moment. So instead of saying like things will never be the same again, you could say, even though things will never be the same, I can grow from what's happening, right? And continue to grow. Or I've met a lot of really important people as I've been going through this hard time, and that's what I'm going to focus on. Focus on the fact that sometimes pain is a little bit less, and pay attention to that. So again, the idea is to bring those forward at times where they might be the most needed. Social support and connectedness, we know, is one of the strongest protective factors in getting people through difficult times. So with Connect, it's about being with the other person, promoting connection. You might not be able to be there for somebody, but you can promote connection with others, or trying to reduce isolation. When people sometimes go into orange and red zones, they tend to either make more mistakes or isolate, and that can create problems with others. So trying to improve understanding with coworkers, trying to correct misconceptions, trying to restore trust, inviting them, including them in things can be really important. One example we gathered, I try to make my staff laugh as much as possible throughout the day. I also take advantage of any lulls throughout the day to hold roundtables where they can voice their concerns, what bothers them. I also try to make myself available and approachable to staff at all times during the day. Really nice example of good leadership. Another person said, I try to help a coworker who is drowning by giving a medication to a patient or starting an IV, just a simple task that will allow them to catch up. We know that Michelle Spunt at the National Center for PTSD studied social support in people with PTSD and found out that the most valued support that they recommended were they loved having people in their life who could provide skills or knowledge to help them improve, who helped reduce their isolation by sharing experiences, who didn't leave them when they were isolating, that maintained the relationship and accepting them without any stigma, who helped them make meaning and integrate by validating them and understanding them and uplifting them, giving them a different way to view things, and also who helped foster emotional regulation by facilitating their coping in whatever way they needed or cueing their need for treatment. So we would, suggest making the most of what we know is the most helpful. And in terms of self-care, what people have told us over the years goes back to what I talked about earlier about permission, all right? So what people have said is this: know the value of good mentors and friends. Don't ever take that for granted, and try to surround yourself with people who are genuine and authentic and honest, and cultivate those relationships. Make time for them. Don't let them fall off because you're too busy. So even if it's just a quick check-in, make sure that you maintain those connections. Make friends with people that you can be yourself with and talk about what bothers you. If that means that you're ruling out connections with people that you don't feel that way with, it's all about prioritizing the most important connections. And when you're in a high stress job, this is particularly important. So if you have to set boundaries with people that you don't feel that way with, so you can make more time with people who you can be yourself with, do it. It's really important. Discipline yourself to have connections with people who you can be yourself with. And those who know you well enough to say, no, I'm calling BS. I know that you're not okay, even though you say you're okay. Let's talk about it, right? So it's all about priorities and spending time. One example of self-care, this person said, the people I reach out to are honest. It's all about calling a spade, not dancing around it. They're able to give their perspective on my problem and say something like, you need to pick up the pieces and move on. It serves to provide another's perspective and foster honesty. Or they might say, that's not normal for you. I'm skeptical of self-diagnosis. I think you need to get a second opinion from someone who knows you, a fresh perspective. So again, I work with a lot of people who are very introverted, and I always explain when we talk about social connection, it doesn't mean you have to have 50 friends or a huge social network. If you just have one, for some people it's a pet even, but just that kind of support outside of, people that you feel like you have to present a facade with is really, really critical. So we're moving into the last two core actions. Competence is a little bit more complex than the other ones because stress reactions can occur just because people are inexperienced and don't feel competent with their work roles. But another way it can happen is that you could be very competent with your work role, but your stress reactions are causing you to have a loss of your abilities. So for instance, you might be less patient than you used to be, or you might be less able to focus than you used to be. So even though you're very competent at your job, you've lost some of your abilities because of your stress. Or it may be that something has happened on the job that has created a new type of stress reaction that you're not used to dealing with. So you're not competent at dealing with that stress reaction, like having nightmares after traumatic stress, for instance. So with competence, we're trying to foster three different sets of skills. One is just occupational skills. Maybe you need to be trained or retrained. Maybe you need a temporary break and reassigned. But as we improve our occupational skills, we would hope that stress goes down. We also might need to foster well-being skills. So either learning or reestablishing new skills when you get into higher zones of stress. Maybe you need to really focus on things to calm you, help you problem solve or stay fit in one way or another. Or maybe you need to learn new skills to manage reminders or nightmares. Lastly, social skills are important. Most of the people who work in jobs like this tend to be the ones who everyone else goes to for help. So they might not even have the social skill of how to request mentorship or support from others. We've also seen that when people get into the orange and red zones, they might need a refresher on conflict resolution, or maybe they need to set stronger boundaries. So they need a little bit of assertiveness training. So this is where we're looking to build competence, build skills that can help them get through difficult times. One quote that we gathered, we help people when they're exposed to different things, such as teaching techniques to stay focused on the present or not ruminate on memories. Another person said, if someone's second guessing how they did, I'll share with them how I've done something similar. I think when we can share our experience, how it affected us and how we dealt with it, it probably helps the person to understand, all right, I'm doing okay. It's not permanent, it's normalizing, and it's part of the process. I hope what you're gathering from some of these quotes is that this model validates what people naturally do. One person we trained said this, we should change this model to call it human being 101. So if you're good at supporting other people, you're going to fit into pretty much everything that we've talked about with this model. So I hope that it does validate the things that you're already doing. Self-care can be a lot of different things to build competence, right? So establishing new skills, talking more positively to yourself, doing something that's easy to give you a sense of competence, at least in one area of your life, being more disciplined about healthy habits, well-being habits, and then regularly kind of reassessing where your work-life balance needs to be. Might have been different when you didn't have kids. Now that you have kids, you have to look at what you say yes to differently, for instance. Lastly, the last core action is confidence. And in this action, it's got a lot of overlap with competence, but it's really about what's going on inside of a person, whereas competence is more about skills. This is about how the person is feeling and thinking. So we sometimes want to build their trust in themselves or others, rebuild their hope about themselves or the future or how they feel about others, maybe rebuild self-worth if they've, taken a hit in the course of being highly stressed, or rebuild a sense of meaning. So it's a very, as I said, a broad category. And what we found is that little things people do can make a huge difference. So on the job types of things are really important. This quote is a good example. There was a time where I dropped the ball. It wasn't earth-shattering, but it was significant. I was completely unable to connect the dots at all until one day my supervisor talked to me and said, during that same time period, your mom had been terminally ill and then passed away. As obvious as it should have been, I was not able to see the connection until he said that to me. So people can reframe, help you see things differently just by virtue of being a caring coworker or somebody that notices, you may have forgotten the whole context and they can remind you. And there's a lot of confidence actions for self-care, right? Positive self-talk, reminding yourself of what you're good at, focusing on the things that, you've made a difference at, keeping a long-term perspective. Some people have said zooming out, even in the context of difficult times. Look, I need to look at this in the course of my entire life, trying not to take things personally, not pushing yourself too hard, using your wisdom, and relying upon faith. It depends on what that person, practices and what's important to them. One example we gathered, sometimes you have to do some self-talk because there's only so much you can do. You have to be comfortable in saying, I know that I've done everything that I could. I have to get to the point where I'm okay with what will happen because I've done all I can to prepare for it. And I have to trust that it will either be great or it will be a potential learning opportunity. Moving into finishing up talking about the stress first aid model. As I said with the Dave Snowden model, what they're recommending, what fits with our model, is to try to create groups that are action-based, especially when you're in times of uncertainty. Create little groups, teams that are interconnected. And if they're engaged in a task that's related to a problem, being part of a solution gives meaning, even if it feels like, oh, we don't know what's coming next. Find simple strategies that support well-being in the present and the very near future, and then reassess. Dave Snowden said in one of his interviews, aim to do the next right thing. I think that comes from Frozen 2. Do the next right thing. Don't look at long-term goals necessarily. Just stay grounded in the moment and gather stories about what's working for people. Share them, right? Stories you think people should remember. Okay, so our hope for the stress first aid model is that it can help you in your work to reduce stigma so people are just matter of fact about stress reactions, talk about them, help people stay in the job longer. We hope that it helps people feel supported by leadership when they bring in these types of core actions or programs. We also hope that it improves your ability to, for yourself and as a team, identify issues. If we're all in the orange for a long time, we need to probably come together and try to problem solve what's going on and bring that up to leadership. So we have on the National Center for PTSD a stress first aid toolkit. This one's aimed for healthcare workers, but we also have manuals for the other agencies and cultures I spoke about. We have slide decks. We want you to take the model and just use it, right? We want you to learn it. We have workbooks, slide sets, instructors manuals, videos, that kind of thing. So if this model resonates and feels like it could be helpful, please feel free to take it and use it. It was developed in the public domain. We want it to be circulated. And I hope this conversation and this webinar has been helpful for you in thinking about ways that you can support yourself and your colleagues during times that might feel uncertain or difficult. Thanks so much.